The cloud deck over the Red River Valley was a solid, suffocating blanket of grey, hanging just 3,000 feet above the rice paddies. It was January 2nd, 1967. To the naked eye, the sky was empty, a vast, oppressive void of moisture and static. But in the electromagnetic spectrum, the air was screaming. Deep beneath the earth, in a reinforced concrete bunker north of Hanoi, the air was cool, filtered, and smelled faintly of ozone and stale tobacco. This was the nerve center of the Vietnam People's Air Force, the Ground Control Intercept, or GCI command post. Here, the war was not fought with sweat and G-forces, but with grease pencils, transparent plotting boards, and the rhythmic sweep of Soviet-made radar systems. The senior controller, a man who had memorized the flight schedules of the United States Air Force better than the American commanders themselves, leaned back in his chair. He watched the blips materialize on the P-12 spoon rest radar scope. The glowing green phosphor told a story he had seen 100 times before. The formation was precise, the altitude was medium, the speed was consistent with heavy loads, and most importantly, the electronic signature, the jamming strobes cluttering his screen, was unmistakable. He turned to his junior officer, a young lieutenant eager for a kill. "It is the thuds," the senior controller said, his voice dripping with a professional boredom that bordered on contempt. F-105 Thunder Chiefs. The Americans are creatures of habit. They fly the same routes at the same time, with the same call signs. The lieutenant watched the strobes. "Should we scramble the 921st? The senior controller lit a cigarette, the smoke curling up toward the ventilation ducts. "Of course, it will be a turkey shoot. The thuds are laden with bombs. They cannot maneuver. They are flying blind in the clouds, relying on their instruments. Send the MiG-21s. Tell them to pop up through the overcast behind them. The Americans have brought us another shipment of targets." He laughed, a dry, sharp sound. It was the laughter of a man who believes he has solved the equation of his enemy. He believed the Americans were arrogant, technologically dependent, and tactically stagnant. He believed that his radar screens told the absolute truth. He believed that in 10 minutes, the wreckage of American bombers would be burning in the jungle. He was wrong. What that controller was seeing on his screen was not a formation of lumbering bombers. He was looking at a ghost, and up in the grey soup above, the most dangerous predator in the sky was waiting for the trap to snap shut. The arrogance of that bunker, the belief that technology cannot lie and that patterns are permanent, was about to be dismantled by a masterclass in deception that would change the history of aerial warfare. Before we dissect the anatomy of this massacre, and before we reveal how a simple electronic pod and a mustache-wearing colonel broke the back of an entire air force, we need to understand the machinery of the trap. If you appreciate the engineering of history's greatest deceptions, make sure you are following along as we peel back the layers of this classified operation. To understand the sheer magnitude of the shock that was coming, you have to understand the stalemate that existed in late 1966. The air war over North Vietnam had become a deadly, frustrating grind for the United States. The primary workhorse of the bombing campaign was the Republic F-105 Thunder Chief, affectionately and terrifiedly known as the Thud. The Thud was a monster of an aircraft. It was the largest single-engine fighter ever built, designed for a nuclear war in Europe that never happened. It was fast, incredibly fast down low, but it was heavy. When fully loaded with 750-pound bombs for a strike run against the rail yards or bridges of the north, it handled like a brick. It bled energy in turns. It was not a dogfighter, it was a hauler. Hunting these haulers was the Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-21, the fishbed. Small, delta-winged, and capable of Mach 2, the MiG-21 was a dedicated interceptor. It was designed to scramble fast, climb hard, fire a missile, and run away. The Soviet doctrine used by the North Vietnamese was simple and effective. GCI control. The pilots were not free hunters, they were chess pieces moved by the controllers in the bunker. The GCI would vector the MiGs behind the American formations. The MiGs would use the cloud cover to hide, pop up, fire an atoll heat-seeking missile at the bomb-laden thuds, and dive back into the sanctuary of the clouds before the American escorts could react. It was a guerrilla war in the stratosphere. The Americans tried to counter this with the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II. The Phantom was the premier fighter of the Western world. 2 engines, 2 seats, a massive radar, and a payload of Sparrow and Sidewinder missiles. It was faster and more powerful than the MiG. But the North Vietnamese had figured out the American game. When the F-4s flew escort, the MiGs stayed on the ground. They could see the difference on radar. The F-4s had a different radar cross-section, different radio frequencies, and different jamming gear. The North Vietnamese refused to fight the Phantoms. They waited for the thuds. They waited for the prey that couldn't fight back. This selectivity was destroying American morale. The F-105 pilots felt like bait. They were flying into the teeth of the most concentrated air defense network in history, getting jumped by MiGs they couldn't see, while their F-4 escorts flew useless circles nearby, unable to draw the enemy into a fight. The loss rate was climbing. The frustration was boiling over in the officers' clubs and briefing rooms. The system was broken. The Americans were bringing massive technological superiority to the fight, but the enemy was using information superiority to nullify it. Enter Colonel Robin Olds. Olds was not a typical officer. He was a triple ace from World War II, a man who had flown P-38s and P-51s against the Luftwaffe. He was a throwback, a warrior scholar who despised the bureaucratic rigidity that had infected the Air Force in the 1960s. When he took command of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base, the Wolfpack, he found a unit that was dispirited and defensive. Olds knew that you couldn't defeat the MiG-21 with better missiles or faster planes if the enemy refused to fly. You had to defeat the system. You had to defeat the mind of the controller in the bunker. You had to make him believe a lie so compelling that he would bet his entire Air Force on it. The plan was hatched in a smoke-filled room, fueled by bourbon and desperation. It was codenamed Operation Bolo. The concept was simple, but the execution required a level of discipline and technical precision that was almost unheard of. The core of the problem was the electronic signature. The North Vietnamese radar operators identified the F-105s largely by the QRC-160 jamming pods they carried. These pods were electronic countermeasures devices that hung under the wings of the thuds. When the Soviet-made radars swept over them, the pods transmitted a jamming signal that created noise and clutter on the scope. To the GCI operators, that specific barrage noise was the fingerprint of a thud. The F-4 Phantoms didn't carry the QRC-160. They didn't have the wiring for it. They relied on different internal jammers or simply speed. So, when the radar screen lit up with QRC-160 jamming strobes, the GCI knew, here come the bombers. Old's idea was a masterpiece of technological mimicry. He ordered his maintenance crews to do the impossible, rig the F-4 Phantoms to carry the QRC-160 pods. This was not a standard modification. It required emergency engineering, jury-rigged wiring, and a frantic logistical scramble to strip the pods off the F-105s and mount them on the F-4s. But the pod was only half the lie. A radar signature is more than just jamming noise, it is behavior. The F-105s flew specific profiles. They flew at specific altitudes, usually around 12,000 to 15,000 feet. They flew at specific speeds, around 540 knots. They used specific radio call signs and communication procedures. To sell the lie, the Wolfpack had to become actors. The F-4s would not fly like fighters. They would not fly high and fast. They would fly the exact slot of a thud strike force. They would adopt the call signs of the F-105 squadrons. They would fly the same routes, hit the same timing checkpoints, and use the same refueling tracks. They would become a wolf in sheep's clothing, but on a spectral level. They would project the electronic and behavioral ghost of a vulnerable bomber formation into the minds of the enemy commanders. The planning required absolute secrecy. If the North Vietnamese got wind of the modification, the trap would fail. The pilots were briefed in sealed rooms. The tension was palpable. They were being asked to fly into the heart of the enemy's strength at a disadvantageous altitude, carrying a heavy drag-inducing pod, and wait to be attacked. On the morning of January the 2nd, the weather was terrible. A thick overcast blanketed the entire target area. In a normal war, the mission would have been scrubbed. You cannot bomb what you cannot see. But for Operation Bolo, the bad weather was a force multiplier. It meant the North Vietnamese ground observers couldn't use binoculars to visually identify the planes. They would have to rely entirely on their radar. They would have to trust the lie. Robin Olds strapped into his F-4C Phantom. His call sign was Olds 011. He led the first flight. Behind him, wave after wave of Phantoms were launching from Ubon and Da Nang, timed to arrive over the target area in 5-minute intervals. This was designed to simulate the continuous stream of a heavy bombing raid. As the Phantoms pushed north, crossing into enemy airspace, the cockpit environment was a study in controlled chaos. The hum of the electronics, the hiss of the oxygen regulator, the static of the radio. Olds checked his switches. The QRC-160 pod was active. To the electromagnetic eye, his sleek, deadly fighter now looked like a fat, bomb-laden truck. The formation was critical. They were flying the Fluid 4 tactical formation, a loose, mutually supporting arrangement that Olds had drilled into his men. This was the antithesis of the rigid Soviet doctrine. In the Fluid 4, the wingmen covered the leaders and the element leaders covered each other. It was flexible, organic, and lethal. But for now, they had to fly straight and level, mimicking the drone-like path of the bombers. Deep in the bunker, the trap clicked shut. "Targets detected," the radar operator called out. "Multiple flights. Heavy jamming. Speed 540 knots. Altitude 14,000 feet. It is the Thuds." The senior controller nodded. The weather was protecting the ground targets, but the Americans were stubborn. They were coming anyway. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for. The F-4 escorts were likely patrolling at high altitude, useless in the clouds. The bombers were exposed. "Scramble the 901st Regiment," the controller ordered. "All flights. Intercept at Phuc Yen." At Phuc Yen Air Base, the alarm klaxons screamed through the mist. North Vietnamese pilots, the elite of their air force, sprinted to their MiG-21s. These were silver darts, armed with heat-seeking missiles and a 23mm cannon. They were light, agile, and climbing into a sky they believed belonged to them. The MiGs blasted down the runway, afterburners tearing through the gloom, and punched through the cloud deck. Their plan was standard: pop up from below, find the heat signature of the heavy American engines, fire, and dive away. They expected to see the distinct cruciform shapes of F-105s, laden with bombs, struggling to turn. Up in the grey, Robin Olds was waiting. He was watching his radar, but the ground clutter was bad. He knew they were coming. He could feel it. The timing was perfect. He was exactly where a Thud flight leader would be. "Olds 01, music on," he called, confirming the jamming pods were singing their song of deception. Then, the reality shattered the illusion. The first MiG-21 burst through the clouds at 10 o'clock, banking hard to get behind what he thought was a bomber. But the bomber didn't lumber, it didn't panic. Olds saw the silver flash. "MiG! 10 o'clock. The F-4 Phantom, supposedly a heavy striker, suddenly shed its disguise. Olds slammed the throttles to full afterburner. The twin J-79 engines roared, dumping raw fuel into the exhaust. The Phantom, which had been feigning lethargy, exploded with kinetic energy. The MiG pilot must have frozen. His radar had promised him a victim. His eyes were showing him a predator. The cognitive dissonance in that split second was fatal. The F-105 has a single vertical stabilizer and air intakes at the wing roots. The F-4 has a massive tail, dihedral wingtips, and intakes on the fuselage. The silhouette was wrong. The energy state was wrong. The entire world was wrong. The MiG broke left, trying to dive back into the clouds, but Olds was already moving. He pulled the Phantom into a vector roll, a violent high G maneuver that translated his forward velocity into a vertical pursuit. It was a move born of thousands of hours of combat experience, a move that defied the textbook. The radar lock was impossible in the clutter. Olds switched to heat seekers. He heard the growl of the AM-9 Sidewinder. Good tone. Fox 2. The missile leapt off the rail, tracing a line of white smoke through the grey sky. It impacted the MiG's tailpipe. There was a flash of orange, a puff of black smoke, and the silver dart disintegrated. One down. But the sky was filling with them. The GCI, still confused, kept feeding MiGs into the meat grinder. They were popping up all around the formation, expecting bombers and finding fighters. Forward flight, break right. MiG at 6. Rambler, I've got one on my tail. The radio discipline cracked, replaced by the urgent clipped shouts of men in a knife fight. But this was a knife fight where one side had brought a gun. The F-4s jettisoned their centerline fuel tanks. They were clean, they were fast, and they were angry. The fluid 4 formation proved its worth. As a MiG latched onto the tail of one Phantom, the wingman would slide across and clear his 6. It was a deadly dance of mutual support. The North Vietnamese pilots trained to attack lone bombers or rigid formations didn't know how to handle this swirling, chaotic melee. They were isolated. Their GCI controllers, staring at screens that still showed bombers, were giving them commands that made no sense. Target is ahead, 2 kilometers, the controller would radio. Target is an F-4. It is turning onto me, the pilot would scream back. Impossible. Radar confirms F-105 signature. Attack. This disconnection, the ghost effect, paralyzed the North Vietnamese response loop. They were fighting a phantom in the literal sense. The Americans were not where they were supposed to be, and they were not what they were supposed to be. Olds pulled his Phantom through another high G turn. The G-suit squeezed his legs, forcing blood to his brain. He saw another MiG-21 popping up, looking for a target. Olds didn't wait. He pulled lead, anticipating the MiG's turn. He fired 2 Sidewinders. The first missile failed to guide, a common frustration with 1960s technology. But the second one tracked true. It slammed into the MiG, blowing the wing off. The pilot ejected, a small figure tumbling into the mist. 2 kills for the old man. The battle raged for 12 minutes. In the era of supersonic jet combat, 12 minutes is an eternity. It is a lifetime. The sky over the Red River was a tangle of contrails, missile smoke, and falling debris. The F-4s were relentless. They used their vertical power to dominate the fight. The MiG-21 was a great turner, but it bled speed quickly. The F-4, with its massive thrust, could fight in the vertical, booming and zooming, striking and extending. By the time the fuel gauges began to run low and the Phantoms turned back toward Thailand, the tally was staggering. 7 MiG-21s had been shot down. The United States Air Force had lost 0 aircraft. Let that sink in. In a single engagement, the Wolfpack had destroyed nearly half of the North Vietnamese Air Force's operational MiG-21 fleet. They had done it right over the enemy's main airfield. They had done it in bad weather, and they had done it without a single scratch on their own paint. The systemic shock to the North Vietnamese military was absolute. The GCI controllers sat in their bunker, staring at the fading blips. The bombers were leaving. But the MiGs were not coming back. The equation had failed. The arrogance of the pattern had been their undoing. For 3 days after Operation Bolo, the North Vietnamese Air Force was grounded. They refused to fly. They had to completely overhaul their command and control procedures. They had to investigate every radar signature, every flight profile. The certainty of their world had evaporated. They could no longer trust their screens. Every blip could be a ghost. Every bomber could be a killer. This brings us to the technical autopsy of the victory. Why did it work so perfectly? It wasn't just bravery. It was the intersection of 2 specific variables: spectral mimicry and tactical fluidity. First, the spectral mimicry. The QRC-160 pod was the hardware, but the flight profile was the software. If Olds had flown the F-4s at 30,000 feet and Mach 1.2, the pods wouldn't have mattered. The radar operators would have seen the speed and altitude and known it was a fighter sweep. By forcing his high-performance jets to fly low and slow to mimic the lumbering gait of the Thud, Olds exploited the confirmation bias of the enemy. He gave them exactly what they wanted to see. He hacked their decision-making loop by feeding it valid data that led to a false conclusion. Second, the tactical fluidity. The Soviet doctrine relied on rigid ground control. The pilot was an actuator for the controller's will. When the reality in the air diverged from the picture in the bunker, the system collapsed. The controller couldn't see the F-4 turning, he could only see the blip. He couldn't improvise. The American pilots, trained in the Fluid 4, were autonomous nodes. They could adapt instantly. When the fight started, the plan went out the window and training took over. The rigid hierarchy of the communist system shattered against the flexible, decentralized discipline of the Western pilots. The scale of this victory cannot be overstated. It wasn't just about shooting down planes, it was about blinding the enemy. It forced the North Vietnamese to question their own sensors. It introduced hesitation into a system that relied on speed. And in aerial combat, hesitation is death. But there is a deeper layer here, a philosophical one. Let's return to that bunker. To the senior controller with his cigarette and his certainty. He looked at the screen and saw data. He saw parameters. He saw a mathematical certainty that X equals Y. He forgot that war is not math. War is poker. He forgot that the blip on the screen is not the thing itself. It is merely a shadow cast by the thing. The arrogance of the GCI was the arrogance of the technocrat. It is the belief that if you have enough sensors, enough data points, and enough doctrine, you can eliminate the fog of war. You can reduce human conflict to an algorithm. Robin Olds, with his non-regulation mustache and his crushed service cap, represented the chaotic human element that no algorithm can predict. He understood that technology is not a crutch, but a costume. He used the enemy's reliance on technology against them. He turned their radar, their greatest asset, into their greatest liability. The ghost effect was not a malfunction of the radar. The radar worked perfectly. It showed exactly what it was receiving. The malfunction was in the human mind interpreting it. The malfunction was the assumption that the enemy would play by the rules. In the aftermath, the silence in the VPAF command bunker must have been deafening. The laughter was gone. The cigarette smoke hung heavy in the air, no longer curling with the confidence of men who know the future. They looked at the green sweep of the scope, and for the first time, they realized they were blind. They realized that the map is not the territory. The legacy of Operation Bolo echoes through every modern air force. It taught the world that electronic warfare is not just about jamming. It is about storytelling. It is about crafting a narrative in the electromagnetic spectrum that compels the enemy to make a mistake. Today, we have stealth fighters that appear as the size of a golf ball on radar. We have digital decoys that can simulate an entire invasion fleet. But the core principle remains the same as it was on that grey morning in 1967. If you rely solely on what the system tells you, if you dismiss the anomaly, if you assume the enemy is incapable of change, you are already dead. The F-4 Phantoms landed back at Ubon that afternoon. The crews were exhausted, soaked in sweat, their flight suits stained with the residue of high-G combat. They were greeted as gods. They had done the impossible. They had swept the skies. But as they walked away from their cooling jets, the metal ticking as it contracted, the lesson they left behind was not about the airframe. It wasn't about the Sparrow missile or the J-79 engine. It was about the mind. The North Vietnamese pilots had been horrified not because they were outgunned, but because their reality had collapsed. They had launched to kill sheep and found wolves. They had launched into a known world and died in an unknown one. That is the ultimate weapon in war. Not the missile that seeks heat, but the idea that seeks doubt. When you can make your enemy doubt his own eyes, his own radar, and his own command, you have already won. The massacre was not just of men and machines. It was a massacre of certainty. And in the cold, hard calculus of the Cold War, that was the only victory that truly mattered. The skies over Vietnam would remain dangerous for years to come. The war would drag on, but never again would the North Vietnamese look at a jamming strobe on a radar screen and laugh. Never again would they assume they knew what was coming through the clouds. The ghost of the wolf pack had moved in, and it would haunt that bunker forever.